is the accepted view of the fall of Rome, you know, rape and pillage, destruction the way Hollywood does it. But what really let the barbarians walk all over the Romans was something it won't take you a second to sympathize with. The taxes were too high to pay for the army that was losing all the battles and a bunch of freeloaders in government, and of course, to pay for thousands of civil servants. So for the Western Romans, better the barbarian you didn't know than the tax collector you did. So the place fell apart. The imperial provinces cracked up into small barbarian kingdoms. And all that big-time stuff you have to have with imperial government, you know, superhighways, theatres, aqueducts, were no longer worth the upkeep. That's why we're here, outside Arles. This aqueduct fed the biggest industrial complex in Europe with water to run the wheels of the great grain mills at Barbegal. 28 tons of flour a day, a technological marvel perhaps to be lost forever in the chaos. All through this period, the so-called Dark Ages, the one organisation that still functioned internationally, still travelled the Roman roads when nobody else would, handling the king's local and foreign affairs because its members could still read and write, was the Church. It had a fully operational network of communications from bishop to bishop throughout Europe, and that's what held things together. The Church then was like our telecommunications now. And so the knowledge that the monks had accumulated gradually spread. Knowledge like how Barbegal had worked, with the great water wheel and the gearing system that made it so efficient. And in the end, by the Middle Ages, look what they did with that wheel. Here's the wheel being operated by water, and here's the gearing system turning the horizontal movement vertical, then horizontal again, and then vertical again in order to operate the millstones. Here's another system operating a trip hammer for bashing things like mineral ore or cloth or leather, soften it up. Here's a system that operates a similar trip hammer device, but it's to work a suction pump for a water supply. Same system again, operating two levers, pressing on bellows for a blast furnace. And finally over here, a crank that turns a circular movement into back and forward movement for a sawmill. Beautiful system. So, put yourself in their position. The wars are all over. There's loads of productive land everywhere. You've got water coming out of your ears and an amazing machine to use to harness the power. What would you do? Yes, you'd have yourself a medieval industrial revolution. The great thing about these wheels was that they were easy to make and they'd work almost anywhere. You lived up a mountain, hollow a few trees out, and you had yourself a wooden aqueduct. Horizontal wheels didn't need gears because they spun millstones directly above. You could turn a vertical wheel with water falling from above or flowing past below in a river. And with gears, you could slow down the effect of a fast stream or speed up a slow one. Water power made you a lot of bread, in both senses. But the star of the show was this, the cam. With a cam, you can trip hammers to pound things with, harder and faster than any human being. And build yourself mills to work. Timber, oil, grain, leather, cloth, iron, beer, wire, sugar, coin, you name it. It took a lot of energetic monks to get it all together. Now, they were energetic because in 1098, a bunch of Benedictines, fed up with the luxury and the ritual, lit out for the wild country and the simple life. And St. Benedict's original idea that hard work was good for the soul. But it was the way these Cistercians organized themselves that turned them into a medieval multinational and gave Europe systems management. See, each monastery had to be self-sufficient in food, so they cut back on the praying and added 6 hours labor a day. They went into rearing animals, clearing and draining land, they went out looking for new plants they could grow, and they wrote each other reports on the latest developments. Like this one, growing vines on bad land, hillside terraces. They used all the technology available: wine presses, water mills, iron foundries. A Cistercian abbey was like a corporation, with the special advantage that at the end of a hard day's business, they served the house wine in the company canteen. Mind you, the food wasn't that hot. No meat, they sold all that. Just vegetables, nettle soup, a few roots, bread, and silence, while you listen to instructive selections from the Corporation Handbook on Getting Spiritual and Managerial Strategy Right, otherwise known as the Rule of St. Benedict.
Non veni facere voluntate meam, sed eius qui misit me. Sed ecce ipsa...
Well, with this kind of organization, how could you fail? Within a century, there were nearly 600 Cistercian monasteries. These monks did everything with fanatical discipline. Nothing got in the way, no fancy architecture or ritual or color to distract from the corporate image of efficiency. And as their lands and their management techniques developed, the news spread to the world outside. Maybe their single biggest success was their sheep-rearing techniques, because by the 13th century, they were producing the best wool in Europe. So, there were the Europeans of the 12th century, with all that amazing water power technology and the red-hot industrial management systems worked out by the Cistercians, almost waiting for something to happen, something that would generate enough money to trigger the economy off into high gear. And when that something happened, it was one of those examples of the way change can come about quite unexpectedly. Because the two inventions that were to trigger the great leap forward could never have been foreseen here in Europe, because they came from China. The Arabs brought them to us. And what a gift they were. The first one of those Chinese gifts was a new loom, and it immediately caused a problem. It speeded up weaving because the thread lifting business was now done by foot pedals, not by the weaver's hands anymore. The new loom produced cloth so fast, they ran into the problem of not enough yarn. See, up to then, you spun yarn in a way that hadn't changed for centuries. You teased the fibers out of the mass and hand-twisted them onto a spindle. It took hours. Then, in the 13th century, the second Chinese idea arrived and solved the problem because it produced yarn fast enough to keep up with the new loom. It was the spinning wheel. Early on, they didn't have much more than the wheel and the spindle. Foot pedals came later. But these two simple bits of machinery fitted together like bits of a jigsaw. And when they did, the places they were used got very, very rich. Places like Bruges. Bruges was one of the richest of the medieval cities built by the woolen trade, and if you know anybody called Draper, boy, were his ancestors well off. The cloth merchants made so much loot, they didn't know what to do with it. They built roads, canals, guild halls, cathedrals. They even had their own laws. And in spite of all that, they still had enough money left for high-technology music. Not just this kind of toy, the kind you can still hear in the cathedral towers all over Belgium, where the carillon still plays. Recognize the mechanism? It's the cam again, tripping levers that pulled wires that eventually pulled the clapper on one or other of a number of differently tuned bells. You set the cams in like pegs to trip certain levers and ring certain bells. Now, the reason all the good burghers had all these extra goodies was because they'd found a new market for their wool. See, all over Europe, people now had surplus, and surplus always looks for a ready market. South from Scandinavia and England and Flanders came fur and wool and cloth. North, through the Mediterranean, through Genoa and Venice, came silk and spices from the Far East. East, from France and Spain, came salt, wine and Cordovan leather. And from Russia, fur, I suppose. Everybody's crossroads lay in the county of Champagne at 4 little towns where they set up the first international markets, called the Champagne Fairs. The biggest fair was held at Troyes, in those days half the size of London, and merchants turned up because they got a special safe conduct from the king and armed guards along the road. Of course, the town made a bit out of it too. You had to pay a license to set up your stall, and there was a sales tax, isn't there always? And you had to pay to come in and out of town. Not that any of this bothered the merchants, they just upped the price. Funny how some things don't change. Anyway, this international money-making went like a house on fire, especially among those able to turn up with the very, very rare stuff, like silk, where you really made a packet. Most of the really fancy stuff was brought by the Italians, who practically ran the place. By 1275, there were no less than 15 Italian cities who had consulates here in Troyes. The reason the Italians mattered so much was because when everybody got back from a crusade in the Middle East to their rather dull northern European town, all they could talk about were the amazing luxuries of the mysterious Orient. Silk, cinnamon, pepper, elephant tusks. Things which the Italians were very well placed to provide at the fairs. The Venetians, the Genoese, and the Pisans all had trading colonies all around the eastern Mediterranean, where they could pick up stuff from as far away as China. Well, there was so much money to be made here, and given the fact that the Genoese have always had a reputation for being where the profits are, it's not surprising that it was probably they who came up with a way to keep the financial ball rolling, so to speak, with this thing. It's an investment contract called a commenda. Now, this is a copy, but this particular one was written on the 14th of November, 1244, and it's a contract between a travelling merchant called John of the parish of St. Genesius and a draper called Otto, there's Otto, who is investing 81 Genoese pounds as a share in a load of purple cloth and gold silk that John the merchant is bringing up here to the Champagne Fairs. The agreement goes on to say that John can use his discretion as to where and when he trades, on condition that when he gets back to Genoa, Otto gets detailed accounts and his share of the profits. This tatty bit of paper, which looks like an everyday affair thing you write in the back of an envelope practically, represents a really fundamental innovation, because it brought everybody, rich and poor, who had any spare cash in on the act. And that spread the risk, and that encouraged more merchants to go to more places. So the Champagne Fairs and others, places like this, really boomed. It looked as if good times were here to stay. And then, at the beginning of the 14th century, came a change in the weather. Freezing winters, rain summers. Bad harvests followed, and then famine. With little or no surplus crops to sell, money became tight, and the fairs began to fail. All over Europe, people tightened their belts. And in this weakened condition, they were virtually defenseless against attack. And when it came, in 1347, the effect was devastating. All the more so because they had no defense against the enemy. It was a flea. The flea carried the Black Death, and from when it arrived in Europe in 1347 on board ship from the Crimea to when it receded only 4 years later, it killed maybe 40 million people. 200,000 villages were totally wiped out. At the height of the plague, there weren't enough living to bury the dead. The flea sucked the disease in rat's blood, and when the rat died, it jumped onto people and bit them. The effect was appalling. From fever to abscesses in the groin and armpits to death inside 24 hours. Black pustules spread all over the body, which was why they called it the Black Death. The effects were particularly bad in the towns, packed with people busy making all that money. The plague ripped through them. And a new face appeared in all the pictures. And for those with itchy feet, a new kind of dance you could unexpectedly find yourself swinging to. The dance of death.